Switzerland sits right in the middle of Europe, yet modern armies never managed to swallow it after its neutrality was formally recognized in 1815. That sounds like magic, but the real answer is much tougher, colder, and more practical than a simple story about lucky mountains. Switzerland survived because it was hard to invade, ready to fight, useful to keep intact, and very good at making conquest look expensive. So if you have heard that Switzerland was never invaded, the first thing we need to do is clean up that claim. Switzerland was invaded in earlier history, and revolutionary France even conquered it in 1798 and created the Helvetic Republic. So the stronger question is not why nobody ever touched Switzerland, but why modern Switzerland became such a difficult target. The answer starts with the ground itself, because geography shaped almost every later choice the Swiss made. Much of Switzerland is covered by the Alps, while the Jura Mountains help shield other parts of the country from easy movement. That means armies do not enter a flat, open field. They enter a maze of valleys, passes, bridges, tunnels, and narrow routes. Mountains do not make invasion impossible, but they make every step harder, moving troops, feeding them, aiming artillery, and protecting supply lines. In flat land, a strong attacker can spread out and move fast. In alpine land, choke points multiply, and one broken route can slow everything. Weather also joins the fight, because snow, cold, fog, and rough slopes turn the landscape into another defender. That alone still would not have saved Switzerland, because mountains only matter if the people living in them are prepared to use them. Swiss leaders learned that lesson early, and over time they built a national habit of defense tied directly to the land. After the defeat at Marignano in 1515, Swiss politics moved away from big expansion dreams and toward survival in a crowded continent. Neutrality grew over time, and after the Napoleonic Wars it was formally recognized at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. That diplomatic recognition mattered because the great powers liked the idea of a neutral buffer in the middle of Europe. But paper alone never keeps armies out, so the key phrase is not neutral Switzerland, but armed neutrality. Switzerland did not say, "Please leave us alone because we are peaceful." Switzerland said, "We will not join your wars, but if you cross our border, we will make you bleed for every road you take." That message changed how stronger neighbors calculated the cost of an invasion. A small country can survive near larger powers when attacking it looks like more trouble than it is worth. That is exactly what Switzerland worked to create. A reputation for resistance so serious that conquest looked irrational. One of the biggest tools behind that reputation was the militia system. Military service became tied to citizenship, which meant defense was not just the job of a tiny professional force. It became a broad national duty, and that gave Switzerland a large pool of trained people relative to its population. Even today, military or alternative civilian service still plays a major role in Swiss civic life, especially for men. For foreign planners, that meant invading Switzerland was not like crushing a decorative army at a ceremonial gate. It meant dealing with a mobilized society that expected resistance and knew the local ground better than any outsider. Swiss defense planning also reached beyond soldiers and rifles into roads, tunnels, bridges, and fortifications. The country prepared to destroy key routes if an invader tried to use them, which could trap columns and wreck supply movement. That kind of demolition planning matters because modern armies do not win on courage alone. They win on fuel, food, repairs, and movement. If the bridges fall, the tunnels close, and the mountain roads become traps, even a strong army can turn into a slow target. So Swiss defense was not just about firing from mountaintops. It was about using the whole country like a weapon. This idea became famous in the Second World War through the National Redoubt. The broader idea existed earlier, but General Henri Guisan gave it a clear wartime form after France fell in 1940. Swiss leaders knew that lowland cities and industrial areas might be hard to hold against a giant modern attack. So they built a deeper threat. Even if an enemy entered the plateau, the war would not end there. Swiss forces could retreat into heavily fortified alpine zones and keep fighting from strong mountain positions. Those positions were tied to strategic transit routes, especially the central alpine corridors that mattered for movement across Europe. That meant conquest would not simply require crossing the border and raising a flag in a capital city. It could turn into a long, ugly campaign in brutal terrain against defenders who had planned for exactly that situation. That was the whole genius of the redoubt. It turned occupation into a possible sinkhole instead of a fast victory. This becomes most important when people ask about Nazi Germany, because that is the moment most viewers are really thinking about. Germany did study invasion plans, and Operation Tannenbaum is the name usually linked to those ideas. So the claim that Hitler never thought about invading Switzerland is simply wrong. Plans existed, and Hitler sometimes spoke about the Swiss state with clear contempt. But a plan on paper is not the same as a good strategic choice in the real world. Germany had many reasons to pressure Switzerland without taking on the full cost of conquering it. The first reason was military cost, because Alpine war against prepared defenders would have been expensive in men, time, and equipment. The second reason was timing, because Germany had larger priorities: Britain, the Mediterranean, and then the Soviet Union. A costly Swiss campaign could drain effort from fronts that mattered more to Hitler's bigger plans. The third reason was usefulness, and this is where history gets very practical. A neutral Switzerland could trade, move money, host diplomacy, and act as a financial and communication node in ways occupied rubble could not. Sometimes a working neutral middleman is more useful to great powers than a smashed territory that must be policed and rebuilt. That does not make Switzerland morally pure during the war, but it does help explain why leaving it intact had value. Swiss wartime history is more complicated than a simple heroic movie, and that matters if we want the real answer. Switzerland preserved its sovereignty, but it also traded with Nazi Germany and handled financially tainted assets during the war years. It also kept restrictive refugee policies at times when desperate people were trying to escape persecution and death. So survival is not the same as innocence, and military deterrence is not the same as moral perfection. Still, the deterrent side was real, and even critics of Swiss myth-making usually agree that invasion would have cost a lot. The Swiss also showed visible seriousness, which matters because deterrence works best when your enemy believes you mean it. They mobilized in 1939, defended their airspace, and even shot down foreign aircraft that violated neutrality early in the war. Inside the country, General Guisan helped frame resistance as a duty, not as a polite suggestion to be abandoned under pressure. That kind of message shapes morale, and morale shapes whether defense plans are believed by both citizens and enemies. Another reason Switzerland lasted is that neutrality was useful far beyond the Second World War. For centuries, the country served as a buffer, an intermediary, and later a home for diplomacy, humanitarian work, and protecting power functions. In plain language, rival states could all gain something from a Switzerland that stayed stable, neutral, and available for contact. Politics is often cruelly practical, and usefulness can protect a small state almost as much as guns do. Economics mattered too, because Switzerland developed high-value industries, precision manufacturing, transport importance, and banking power. A profitable neutral center can be more attractive than a wrecked battlefield with sabotage, resistance, and broken infrastructure. The Cold War added another layer to the same deterrent image. Switzerland built an enormous civil defense system, including a shelter network large enough to cover more than its full population on paper. That does not mean every shelter was a military bunker, but it does show a whole society planning for continuity and survival. When a country builds itself around resilience, enemies notice that the pain of conquest might continue long after the first attack. Several myths need to be stripped away if we want the strongest version of this story. The first myth says mountains alone saved Switzerland, but mountains without mobilization, fortification, and demolition plans would not be enough. The second myth says neutrality meant weakness, when the opposite is closer to the truth in the Swiss case. Swiss neutrality worked because it was backed by readiness to impose serious costs on anyone who ignored it. The third myth says Hitler stayed away because he respected law, but powerful states often ignore law when conquest is cheap. What mattered more was that conquest did not look cheap. There is also an internal side to Swiss strength that people often overlook. Federalism made the country harder to decapitate quickly, local governance supported resilience, and neutrality helped hold together a diverse society. Switzerland had different languages and religious histories, and neutrality became part of the glue that kept it from being pulled apart. So neutrality was not only foreign policy, it was also a tool of national cohesion. Even today, Swiss neutrality is debated, especially after working with international institutions, sanctions, and modern security partnerships. But those later debates do not erase the long historical formula that kept the country alive. Geography gave Switzerland a defensive base, diplomacy gave it recognized neutral status, and the militia system gave it manpower. Fortifications and the national redoubt gave it a survival strategy, while economic and diplomatic usefulness gave stronger neighbors reasons to pause. Put those pieces together and you get one of history's clearest examples of deterrence working. Switzerland was not untouchable because it was magical. It was hard to invade because it trained for that danger, built for that danger, and convinced others that the bill would be painfully high. That is the big lesson. Small states do not survive by hoping the world will be kind. They survive by making aggression look slow, costly, messy, and far less rewarding than leaving them alone. If you want another history story where strategy mattered more than size, watch the next video, because the smartest victories often start before the first shot is fired. Look again at the military map, and you can see why Swiss planning always focused on movement rather than on a fantasy of perfect safety. An army that cannot move cleanly through valleys and passes cannot easily use its strength, and every blocked route multiplies confusion. That is why bridges, tunnels, and rail links mattered almost as much as rifles in the Swiss defense mindset. Destroy the path, and the enemy must spend time rebuilding under threat, while the defender keeps the advantage of local knowledge. This is also why Swiss preparedness had a psychological effect beyond the battlefield. A planner in Berlin or Rome had to imagine not only the first attack, but the weeks and months that might follow afterward. Would the reward be worth freezing troops in alpine positions, guarding damaged routes, and facing a society built to resist from within? That question alone can stop wars before they start, and Switzerland wanted that question hanging over every hostile plan. Notice also that Swiss independence was protected by a mix of old and new tools at the same time. It used ancient advantages like mountains and local cohesion, but also modern advantages like fortifications, mobilization plans, and transport denial. That mix made the country hard to classify, because it was neither a giant empire nor an easy minor state. It was a small but deeply prepared system, and that kind of system can be far more dangerous than its size suggests. Even the idea of a quick symbolic victory did not fit Switzerland well, because the government, army, and people were spread through strong local institutions. An invader could take ground and still fail to secure obedience, which is one more reason conquest promised trouble instead of clean control. So when people say Switzerland stayed free because nobody bothered, they miss the entire point of Swiss strategy. People bothered enough to plan, study, threaten, and pressure it, but the costs stayed high enough to keep turning those plans aside. That is what successful deterrence looks like in real history. Not perfect safety, but repeated proof that attack is a bad bargain. And once that reputation is built over generations, it becomes one more layer of defense, all by itself. In the end, Switzerland's greatest weapon may have been credibility, because every road, bunker, bridge, and mobilization plan told the same story. That story said any invader would face terrain, delay, sabotage, armed citizens, and a war that might continue even after early gains. When a country repeats that message with real preparation for long enough, neighbors start believing it, and belief changes the map. That is why modern Switzerland was not spared by kindness. It was spared because invasion kept looking like a terrible deal. And that is why a small mountain state became one of Europe's hardest targets.